Please do.
I'm going ready.
Yep.
Good. Okay, Happy New Year. Welcome to the 2018 series of Green Infrastructure, Climate, and Cities. And we have, in case you were not here in December, we've developed the 2018 schedule, which is kicked off today with a focus on urban climate change education. Next month we're focusing on climate impacts on water systems. But you see we have a schedule going through next October currently. And for those of you joining us for the first time, we usually have 1 to 3 speakers. Tonight we have sort of a consortium of speakers. These presentations and all previous ones are recorded and webcast, so feel free to go to the CCRUN website and download or view any of the previous presentations going back to 2014, I believe, at this point. And so today our focus is climate and is CUSP, the Climate and Urban Systems Partnership, in this context of urban climate education. And so we have a series of speakers. So Dr. Rachel Valletta and Richard Johnson from the Franklin Institute are here in the room, and I believe they'll kick off the presentation, and then we'll move to some other cities. And I guess I'll let them sort of explain how this is going to work. Okay. So with that, I will invite Dr. Valletta up.
Good afternoon. My name is Rachel. I am the staff environmental scientist at the Franklin Institute and the new director of the CUSP Partnership. That's Climate and Urban Systems Partnership. I'm here today with Richard Johnson, also from the Franklin Institute. He is the CUSP program manager. We'll be giving a brief introduction to what CUSP is all about, and I'll hand it off to Richard for some of the more intimate details of what the project has been up to. The project is entering its 6th year and final year of a $5.8 million NSF funding. Great. So we're here to offer you whatever resources we can and to really strike up some partnerships with you folks as CCRUN gets off the ground. We'll then hand it over to Dr. Marian Steiner of the Steiner Learning Group, Lori Giarratani at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh, and finally Michaela Labrioli at the New York Hall of Science. So when CUSP came online 5 or so years ago, it tried to really come up with a novel blend of climate education. Okay? So that's bringing the forefront of climate science together with the forefront of learning science, together with the forefront of informal education. How could we come up with a novel approach to communicate climate change? The traditional approach of climate communication we found in the literature does not work. Richard will elaborate a little bit on that. So CUSP really wanted to bring it down to the local scale. How can we make climate communication relevant to Philadelphia, more broadly city residents? CUSP is a 4-city partnership. We at the Franklin Institute are the home office in Philadelphia. We also partner with folks in New York City, Pittsburgh, and DC. This is just a snapshot from our website, cusproject.org. And we are asking the big question, how are cities preparing for climate change? Again, we're trying to think up novel approaches to communicating with city residents about climate change. Our informal education partners include National Geographic in Washington, D.C., the New York Hall of Science, NYSCI, in New York City, of course the Franklin, and the Carnegie Museum of Natural History in Pittsburgh. I said also that we are interested in getting that forefront of climate science, okay? And we do that with some CCRUN partners, actually, at the Center for Climate Systems Research at Columbia University. We also partner with the Up Close group, that's the University of Pittsburgh Center for Learning in Out-of-School Environments, for our learning science aspect. And we also expose ourselves to rigorous, independent, external evaluation through the Goodman Research Group. Again, we are trying to engage city residents, and we're thinking about this primary question. How can we engage people in cities in climate change education more often and more effectively? So I'll take us to our little video. I think you queued it up, Richard. Okay.
These people are doing something you might not expect. Having fun while learning about climate change. Climate change can be a complex, scary topic that people avoid talking about. CUS delivers fun, hands-on community programs that take a local, relevant, and solutions-focused approach to climate change education. We do this through a diverse network of informal educators, climate scientists, learning scientists, and local community partners in 4 Northeast cities.
When I enter into the room with CUS partners or into a CUS meeting, it's usually a conversation, and that's something that I love. I know in most situations people are being talked to, and that's not kind of how we operate. It's more of a two-way street. I'm listening, they're listening, and then we're at the end of that conversation, we're focused on solutions.
A lot of the effects of global warming that are happening in other parts of the country and the world, the kids don't see it. They don't realize it's even happening, so they don't think anything of it. And I think this will really bring it home to them.
It makes you use your brain more because you teach you stuff that you never really think about. I'm a kid, I don't really think about how to make my city better, and I think I'm too small to do it anyway. But seeing that I can do something, just a little changes, it helps.
By making learning about climate change personal and fun, CUS provides a safe space for conversations to emerge.
I think it's something that should be talked about more to our children, our neighbors, and even in our churches.
We didn't have this opportunity when we were in school. We were drilled with being homemakers. Now we can learn through the Franklin Institute and through this program how to make it better for ourselves and our community.
The CUS approach really embodies that idea of STEM for all because we're encouraging people to take experiences about climate change and really adopt them in ways that make sense for them. So it's not sort of a prescribed action, and instead it's really empowering people to engage with STEM content and use it to better their lives.
Great. So in that video, we really highlighted a phrase that Richard will now elaborate a little bit on, and it's CUS's approach to outreach education. Okay, so we're talking about local, relevant, and solutions-focused. The video also really highlights the strength of the CUS program and a big success of it, and it's engaging in those comfortable conversations, those two-way conversations. And I'll hand that off to Richard. That's probably a good transition point.
Thank you. All right. So Rachel has been part of the project for all of 2 months. You wouldn't know it from that presentation, I don't think, so I thought she did an awesome job. And what I'll do now is sort of unpack a little bit of what you saw in that video. So we wanted to show you the video because that's CUSP in action. That's kind of CUSP on the street. And I'm thrilled to see some of our local CUSP partners in the room today, and I'm sure there's more online, so hi to you guys. So first, I'll take you back to the beginning of sort of how we were approaching local stakeholders to get everyone on board with a new approach to climate change education. So where we had to start was looking through all of the existing research on climate change communication and seeing if we could identify what wasn't working so that we could innovate in a more effective way. So when you look at climate change education from a sort of traditional approach, and I encourage people to just Google image search climate change and see what comes up, mostly what you're going to find is a very global, abstract, gloom and doom approach to climate change education. And we're talking, polar bears, icebergs, graphs, data, and we were asking our learning science partners if they could look through research and sort of find promising practices. And so almost in response to this traditional approach, which we were finding wasn't getting people to take action, we sort of formulated this response, which was, what if we approach climate change from a local, relevant, solutions-focused manner? And so, just a little elaboration on that. what we mean by that is local, meaning we're addressing local impacts, so it's impacts that are specific to your city, your community. And we did rely on our climate science partners at Columbia University to produce downscaled climate projections for each of our 4 cities. So that was really great. So we weren't just addressing what climate change means for the planet, we were addressing what climate change means for your community. Relevant in the sense that we wanted to talk about what does that mean, not just in terms of sort of that global perspective, but your day-to-day life, or the issues that you care about, that you're passionate about. And solutions-focused, meaning that we were pivoting very quickly from the impacts to look to really digging deeper into what can we do about this. Because what we were finding is that people, when we approached climate change, they really wanted to know 2 things. What does it mean for me, and what can I do about it? And that was, again, in contrast, sort of a more traditional approach to climate change, which was if we only explain the problem, if we let people know about climate change and why it's happening, then they'll care about it and they'll do something. But we know that there are a ton of other factors going on that make this a particularly tricky issue. You've got how people affiliate, who they affiliate with, who are their tribal leaders, who are their trusted messengers, emotion, all of these things come into play, and you could do a whole presentation on the psychology of climate change. In fact, we do sometimes. But we really sort of feel like we did a lot of the legwork, and we have these 3 principles of local relevant solutions focused. That's a starting place for a lot of people. So the other thing that this project was very intentional about was involving local stakeholders. And in the beginning, when we were approaching people, we were basically saying, let's all just try this innovative approach of local relevant solutions focused, and maybe we were saying it maybe even in different terms, more complicated terms than that back in the day. And so what the effect was that people were a little confused about what exactly they should do. So we had these stakeholder networks that we were forming in each city purely based on people just being passionate about communicating climate change. And we were saying, well, let's do something that's more in line with this more current research. And people were having a hard time just kind of wrapping their heads around exactly what that meant for their organization. So what sort of made things click, very much so in Philadelphia and similarly in other cities, is when we had a tangible product that people could look at and say, oh, that's what you meant. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to do one of these activities that made it click for our networks. So the online audience can't see this, but we have provided some tabletop activities for our in-person residents. And so those who braved the cold tonight get to play with us. And I would like to ask Rachel if you could make sure everyone has a kit in front of their small group. And what I'll do for the online folks is I'll demonstrate it, of course, so that you don't feel left out. All right? So yeah, this is not a laptop or tablet-friendly exercise. There's actual water involved. So you might want to clear your area. We have provided some ShamWows, so we do have a plan in place. So this is what we produced at the we sort of adapted a version of this activity that Pittsburgh had created. And we created what we call our Ready Row Home. Okay? So this is a Ready Row Home. Ready for what? Well, it's ready for climate change. And what we'll do when we have audiences, all different audiences, is we'll basically, we'll start out, and don't do this yet, but we'll just talk about, rain. And how do we manage rain in the city? And so we'll actually make it rain. Sorry, Franco. I'll clean this all up. And you notice I had like a nice little gentle rain, and usually we'll do about 10 seconds of that, let people observe how we manage this rainwater in a city. But we're going to skip right to climate change. So we're going to pop off this low flow, nice, gentle rain nozzle. And we're going to address the fact that Philadelphia is getting wetter because we're getting more increased heavy downpours, more flashy storms. So we're going to get more rain like this. All right? So what I want us to all do is to take your... Well, I want you to make it rain. That's what I want you to do. And we're going to do this together for 10 seconds, and I'll count. Okay? So you're going to make it rain all over the neighborhood for 10 seconds. Make sure you don't have that... You have the right... Yeah, your nozzle's off. All right. So, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. All right. I think you just did that 2%. So, unfortunately, this can't be like a normal workshop where we necessarily all together in person dive into all the things that we're noticing. But at this point, it's just observation, right? You're just asking people, what do you see? Where do you know? Like, where's the rain go? What do you notice? And so, just any observations from out in the crowd, and I'll repeat them for the online audience. Anything?
It's out in the street, or
yeah, street.
not necessarily right by the house.
Street flooding, yeah.
But it's not all handled by the gutters and the downspouts.
Right.
It's overwhelming, those gutters and those downspouts. So the cool thing about these models is we can actually look at what's going on. So eventually all the rain is ending up where? Did I hear the sewer drain? You're right. The sewer drain, or the storm drain, right? But what we can do with this activity is we can actually show our audiences what happens after the sewer drain. And so these deli containers are sewers. And it's very apropos we're here at Drexel Engineering because they do a lot of work on the things that we're going to talk about next. But the problem is that we have this line at which the sewer is going to overflow. A lot of people know this, but a lot of general public doesn't. So in bigger cities, older cities especially, all 4 of the northeast cities that CUSP works in, you have this point at which the sewer overflows. You don't have a separate sewer for your rainwater and your sewage. It's a combined sewer. And that raw sewage and that rainwater is just going to overflow unmitigated into our nearest body of water, which is the Schuylkill and the Delaware for Philadelphia. So a lot of people at this point, they're like glad they didn't do this activity before lunch, or like they're really kind of grossed out because we talked about raw sewage in their drinking water supply. And you got to remind people that the water in Philadelphia is totally fine to drink; it gets treated. But you kind of ask them, do you really want that in your rivers in the first place? So again, because we're at Drexel Engineering, this is very apropos. What we're going to do is we're going to ask everyone, how could we redesign our cities, rethink about them, so that we kept this water out of the sewer in the first place? So we have this basket full of ideas, and they're sponges. And what could a giant sponge represent in real life that someone could do to keep water out of the sewer? A rain garden. Someone actually did say that. The rain garden. Right? Anything else? So I'm going to plant my rain garden there. And you guys should feel free to start, being city planners and putting your sponges.
We need sponge. Oh, here we come.
Green roof, right? So eventually, especially for the general public, what we're trying to get at is basically plants. Now I know there's a lot of engineering that's very sophisticated in actual green stormwater infrastructure. We want people to just think plants, because plants act like giant sponges. And then we have these rain barrels, that we 3D printed at the Franklin Institute. And we put those, we let the audience do all of this, right? They get to put all these plants and these rain barrels all over their city, their neighborhoods. And so what you're going to do, this is the last step, I promise, but you're going to take the water that was in your sewer, you're going to refill it with, you're going to put it back in your container, your watering can. All right? We're going to go ahead and, when I say go, we're going to make it rain, again, the same as before for 10 seconds and see what happens, right? So, on your mark, get set, go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And wow, we're getting applause. This is awesome. So, we'll observe, where does the rain go now that it couldn't go before? You'll tell me it's the plants. I'll tell you that's right. And then I'll say, well, did we solve the really big challenge of keeping our sewer from overflowing? And in my case, I am under the line, and hopefully in your case as well. So, if you weren't under the line, again, it's a teachable moment to say, well, did you use all the sponges in your basket? Could you convince your neighbor to get a rain barrel? There's a lot of different directions you could go with this. So, other than just being a really fun thing to do at 4 o'clock at the end of a work day, the week we all go back to work, this was this was like a revelation. This really jump-started a lot of progress with our local stakeholder networks, because all of a sudden they were sort of getting what we were talking about. So for local, in the Northeast, we're getting hotter and we're getting wetter. So we have some activities that address hotter. This one obviously addresses the wetter. So we're focusing on a local impact. This is what's going on in your city. It's not going on in the West Coast or in another country. Here, in our region, in our city, it's getting wetter. Is it relevant? Well, I can tell you, a lot of people, at least in Philadelphia, have a really big problem with flooded basements. Hate it. The thought of the raw sewage pouring into the waterways, drinking water supply, places where people fish and swim, is not sitting well with people. So it's relevant. For hotter, we might talk about the urban heat dome or air quality, but these are sort of the relevant issues that people want to connect. You want to connect this with, and then solutions focused. So this is all great that we talk about this in the abstract, but we also are sure, and we ask all, and our partners are sure to point people to specific local programs that they can take advantage of. So in our case, we always carry around a flyer, and some of you have it maybe, but it's on the rain check program. So fortunately in Philadelphia, you can get residential stormwater management tools for free or reduced cost, right? So a rain barrel in Philly from the rain check program is free, so there's no barrier. So I can actually tell people who say, well, I'm not going to put a green roof on because they think these things are cost prohibitive. I can say, well, actually, you could get a free rain barrel, and they'll install it for free too. And so partners could actually take this and they could adapt it to their own messages, to their own programs. There's a lot of different directions. This is just the hook to get people engaged in having that conversation. So just because I know there's a variety of sort of types of educators, I want to just highlight how this was actually used live fire. And side note, I think everyone is actually an educator. We'll talk if you don't think you are one. But we have, this works, these are images of us or our partners using this out in communities. So it works with younger audience, it works with older adult audiences. We've loaned out, this is the other version that talks about hotter Philadelphia and what you can do about it. And in the sense that I wanted to show that they're very sort of malleable to people's own programs, this is our partner Penn Environment using it at a festival to talk about how not to prepare for a hotter Philadelphia, but how to prevent a hotter Philadelphia. So you can talk about preparation, you can talk about mitigation, It really is sort of very under the banner of local relevant solutions focused and hotter, wetter. You can talk about a lot of different local initiatives. So it's very, adaptable. And then we have, you can do this even with like whole classrooms or workshops, like we're doing right now. So that really brings me to the end of sort of this aha moment that we had, and where this really helped our network sort of get the wheels turning. So we were going to pause here for just a brief, if anybody had questions about this part, and then I'll throw it to my colleague in Pittsburgh.
Do you have any idea of the increase, because you said rain barrels are free, and that's something that you promote, which
Yeah.
I didn't know they installed them too, so
They do.
that's really good to know.
Yeah, in Philly.
But did you know any increase working with them, finding out that there are more rain barrels going out, or?
No, we don't actually, unfortunately, we don't have that evaluation data on that as terms of if this particular sort of activity increased the amount of rain barrels installed. We certainly hope it contributed. Yeah.
Do you, I know CUSP is reaching the end of its cycle. Will these tools be available, post-contract for use in various settings?
Yeah, so the question is if the materials will be ready, available post-project, and the answer for Philadelphia, I can speak for us, is yes, absolutely. And so what we have done, and Pittsburgh and New York and DC, I think are similar, but we have a loan program essentially where any educator, and again, that's a big umbrella because I think you're all educators, they can come to us and they can borrow as many as 20 of these from the museum and do their own workshops. And again, we have the wetter version and we have the hotter version. So you come to the museum, you just have to pick them up. You can loan them, we give them to you for free. You bring them back, and you can do that as many times as you like. And they're going to live at the museum. So, yeah.
Who do we contact to do that?
There's a CUSP email address, which is cusp@fi.edu, but we'll show at the end. It'll be included in the slides.
So how opposed are you to us copying this idea at our own institution? Maybe exactly.
Yeah, well, the question is, how opposed are we about you copying this idea? Imitation is the biggest form of flattery, but we would, if you don't have a lot of resources, to get a product like this is not cheap, quite frankly. So if you're a bigger institution, that might be something you could do, and we could work with you about how to do that. But it's funny, it was a great segue actually, because our colleagues in Pittsburgh actually have approached this from a much more sort of grassroots, sort of DIY approach. And you're going to see some examples of what you could do if you don't have a lot of resources to create something this polished. So I think that's a good segue to Pittsburgh.
All right. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we just need you to share your screen.
Okay, working on it.
Okay.
So I'm Marian Steiner, and during the beginning part of the CUSP project, I was with the Natural History Museum and then with the University of Pittsburgh as part of the learning research team. And with me,
hi, I'm Laurie Giratani. I work at the Natural History Museum.
Yeah. And so I'm going to actually tell you a lot of these stories about the theory behind our work and things that happen along the way, and then Laurie will be there to answer questions along with me as we get through this. So this little box is in the way. So I'm here to talk about the theoretical underpinning of our project, which is this idea of boundary objects. The boundary in boundary objects is this shared space where two or more groups meet, whether they're professional communities or groups with different experience based on culture, age, or location. Boundary objects are a means of translation in that space, so they help one group effectively work with the other as a kind of touchstone. In 1989, Starr and Griesmer built the theory based on their observation of a system they were studying. It was actually the development of an early collection system for a natural history specimen, collection systems of natural history specimens. And they noticed and defined how the system provided flexibility to engage multiple dispersed stakeholders, everyone from scientists to collectors to traders and trappers, while providing the structure to ensure that individual interests of stakeholders were met. So in some ways, you just experienced our project through the example of the Ready Row House that Richard presented. So that holds the structure of our CUSP approach, the local impacts, the relevance to local audiences, and city-level solutions. At the same time, the work it does is flexible. For you, it might excite you about presenting kids to your local about your local issues. For a resident, it might cause them to call the city for a new tree or rain barrel. And for a green infrastructure professional, it might make them aware of and give them ideas about how to address resident concerns about green infrastructure. This is based on talking with people across these boundaries. In this way, the object helps these groups talk across their experience and interests. As a theoretical term, boundary object entered cross-disciplinary learning, like in areas like medicine, systems analysis, education. Studies found boundary objects not only help groups coordinate work, getting the materials into the museum, for instance, but it helps them identify differences in thinking, it helps them define problem parameters, and identify strategies to address that problem. In this way, boundary objects open up conversation and lead to action and new ideas. Many people since '89 have written about boundary objects, and some key qualities that emerge about them are their ability to convene. So they support diverse groups in addressing an idea or task. They can help coordinate work processes and growth over time. So we mentioned, one kid came from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia, then they developed it, and we have the whole process of iteration that we use. And they help externalize thinking. So they help support the identification of questions, group knowledge, and differences in experience by interacting with something that's common to three different groups, for instance. So more than the object as a product, as a kit, or as a map or a tool, they provide a structure for building on the expertise of the full group and generating new ideas. Richard mentioned that too, like all the different ways that people might get excited by the Ready Row House. So when we started CUSP, we had the idea that local examples and networked efforts would be important, as Rachel mentioned. We also had developed this idea of 4 platforms of ideas. So Pittsburgh's working on kits, New York a digital map, DC was working on a community of practice kind of approach, getting all our networks thinking together. And Philadelphia started out with a neighborhood approach. What would it look like if we did climate change across a neighborhood? And each city was taking a lead on developing one of those platforms, and then we would share it. But as we started working, and Richard described this perfectly, the kind of abstractness of the topic and how the networks kind of didn't know how to get started, we realized that having some productive thing to do together was going to make a big difference. And we only found our theory of boundary objects after struggling with this for a little while, and then having the experience of working with people on a project. So this is, again, our networks in each city are very diverse, and we have our theory of action that Richard described. But as we approached people to join this network, we were met with enthusiasm, and people wanted to engage with climate change education. Like Richard said, it was kind of an abstract topic, especially for partners outside the education field, who were used to more handing out information, telling about programs, trying to connect people to resources. So, and this is a Pittsburgh version of one of those talking meetings, but so it's the same thing. It was more talk, less action, or people were still concerned about talking about climate change as being a political message and their stakeholders might get upset. Some people felt like, I already have a really clear message about, say, zero waste. I don't want to complicate that message with a climate change message. And then there were a group, especially we all noticed with New York City working on this digital map. Michaela started with a very small network that was focused on a project, and they were ready to go. And so we started going, that's interesting. And in Pittsburgh, in Pittsburgh, the same thing. Our starting approach to the project was kit building for festival presentations. So the idea was to use physical models as a touch point to elicit the public's experience and thoughts about local climate change impacts, and to have this conversation happen between local residents and a network member with a specific expertise related to that impact. So as we began to convene our network, we found that when we brought an example kit to the introductory meeting, the partners were able to quickly identify with the CUSP approach and see how they might get started using these tangible tools. Richard talked about that as well. So as we all began in the different cities, as soon as Philadelphia, New York, and DC saw our first stabs at kits, they wanted them right away. We were supposed to be delivering them in year 2 or 3 or something, and everyone's like, no, let's just start right now. So we started just sharing ideas across the 4 cities. And for instance, in New York City, one of the New York City group built some kits right away, and one of the members from their network said, here's something I can glom onto to help me do what I'm tasked with doing. There's lots of other brains out there who are working on this, and I'm excited to connect with that. So she could see how this related to her work and how it expanded her thinking. And after they actually used a kit with an audience, many of our partners have been really impressed with the kinds of conversations that result. So one of our partners in Pittsburgh said that CUSP provides an interactive piece, kits for example, to move us from talking to interacting with people, and also working with physical interactions with kids. From this, we see a lot more light bulbs going off now. So they really switched from kind of a lecture-y presentation to a more engaged one. So if we go back to the boundary object qualities, those first 2 parts talked about how kits helped us convene our network. Now, we're going to talk about how it helped us coordinate a shared work process. So initially, when we would have a network meeting, we would put out a bunch of kits and ask the participants to play with them, talk about them, think about them, and then give us suggestions about how to improve them and make them align more with their own work. And then also tell us, are there new themes that we should be trying to address? We wanted to be sure that the kits reflected their interests because we wanted them to use them. That was the whole goal, that to broaden out all the audiences we could reach by working with these very network members. Before long, our Pittsburgh partners were asking if they could come and help build kits, which was a really great surprise. We didn't want to overburden people who didn't have a lot of time, but they were coming to us saying, we want to build kits. So this led to the development of a series of kit building workshops at the local Center for Creative Reuse that replaced some of the more general discussion-based network meetings. So instead of coming to, monthly network meetings, we would have kit building workshops and then maybe a quarterly network meeting. So doing this project-based work shifted people from a passive to an active role in climate change education. One of our partners at Pittsburgh Park Conservancy said, it's about learn and amplify. She loves the learning network and the space for thinking about climate change education that CUSP provides. It gives us a nudge to bring climate change into our work. So we started to see people move from fretting about it to, oh, now I see how to do this and I see how it actually helps me do a better job. In the first 2 years of the project, Lauren Allen worked on a study with her advisor, Kevin Crowley, that tracked our early network activities. So what she found was from the beginning that kit development was iterative, based on a cycle of prototyping, testing, and adjusting. And what she saw was that the shared system of inquiry gave the network a transparent way to think about and try changes to the kits and other network activities. So even though the network changed how they engage with kits and each other over time, the shared system of inquiry was constant and facilitated the network evolution. So the iterative cycle began for participants at any point in that circle. Some started with a festival as their first experience. Some came to a network meeting for the first experience, and others had their first experience at a cusp kit workshop. So at the network gatherings, this is what this image is of. This is what our meetings start out looking like. The network partners review current kits by trying them out, discussing them, and writing a few notes. And then as a large group, the participants generate a kit quality list. What makes them compelling? What features do they share? What possible additions would be useful in a particular kit? And this list is then posted in the room as the meeting continues. And we do that at the beginning of a kit workshop too, actually. The process helps to expose partners to available resources. Which kits do I want to borrow? Sometimes people don't know what's available until they actually get a chance to play with it. It sets the tone that this is an iterative group and change and additions are welcome, that we don't see these as finished kits, that these are kits to adapt to your own needs. And it results in an understanding of how the kits fit the custom model based on group definitions and descriptions of the experience. So we let the language emerge from the group. We do a little bit of like, oh my God, that's so cool that you saw the local connection or that you saw the systems connection. That's something that we really care a lot about. We might call out things, but basically we want them to define it. At the design workshops, partners in each city work together to brainstorm and model an idea. They incorporated a local impact and a way to give their audience an active role in exploring how that impact relates to a local city system. So for instance, Mayor for a Day, where participants have to balance out different sustainable practices within a budget, or air quality issues, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, or multimodal transport questions. So how do you make a city street that's amenable to cars, people, buses, bikes? So this also occurred in partner collaboration projects, which Michaela will speak a little bit more about in the next section, where people were getting together and using the custom approach to come up with new ideas. And then testing. So getting ideas out quickly before they are too perfect is also an important part of the process. Partners borrow the kits to use at festivals in various states of completion, and they provide feedback on the experience to the network. These experiences with the public validate the designs that work well, giving our partners confidence in talking about climate change and using the kits. But they also help us determine which ideas to move on from without too much more investment. So we were able to shelve a lot of ideas that just didn't quite fly, like our beautiful garlic mustard kit, which was just too complicated for people to understand. So we put that to the side and then moved on to another project. And sometimes we'll go back and pull an activity back out and make it work once we figure out a better mechanism. So the last part of the boundary objects theory was this idea of externalizing, and this happened in many ways. Like I said, the reflections on the kit experience. So if you look at the right-hand picture, it's a kit workshop in New York, and you can notice in the back of the room on the right is their list of features or qualities, and I don't think you could probably read it, but I'll read. They had said they noticed that there were local examples, that it was hands-on and a real experience, something changed in the model, that there were opportunities to compete or collaborate. So this idea that people were actually participating in it. There were colors, textures that sort of sparked imagination. There were real examples that people could relate to, and that they helped people weigh popular versus rational choices. So kind of getting back, that one was exciting because it's getting back to the chart Richard showed about the emotional and social context of making actual behavior change. That these guys, before they saw any of those slides, were picking up on that notion. And that you could try again and reiterate. There wasn't just one answer or one way to solve the problem. So the point of these sheets, again, is to capture what the group notices, draw out some of the intended pieces from the CUSP approach, and mention any areas to improve the design. And I'll have to say that often it was the system solutions part that fell into the, we need to get better at this. So that was always a struggle, was broadening it out beyond the personal experience. So externalizing thinking was also reflected in kit designs and additions that partners recommended. So for instance, one of our partners asked if she had gone to festivals, seen all the kits, and she said, do you guys have an air quality kit? And the CUSP staff said, hey, let's organize a kit workshop and build one. So that partner came to the workshop and later told us how exciting it was to work with someone from the healthcare sector, her own organization that focused on trees, and the third participant who was just happened to be a really good tinkerer and good at thinking about the mechanism of the game. So she took a seed idea from the workshop, which was this air quality Plinko board, brought it back to her organization, and with one of the other partners, developed the idea out, and then shared it back with the network where people tested it, both in network meetings and also out in the community, as you see on the left with another project where this young man was teaching adults in the community about climate change impacts. Oh, and the way the game works is you drop these little, each person rolls a dice and gets different kinds of factors about age, health, income, neighborhood, and then you get a number of chips based on if you got good or bad scores on those things, if you have liabilities in those areas. And then as you drop them down the board, you can see there's little faces with tongues sticking out and then some with their thumbs up. And if you land in a bad spot, that means you've had an asthma attack based on the extreme, the poor air quality based on climate change, hotter summers and wetter weather. And so then what you can do is you can take a piece of some kind of a barrier that cuts across the little the spokes that the things are jumping off of, and you can name it. Like, this is a city policy that means people can't drive odd-numbered cars on odd days or something. So something that would mitigate the amount of pollution going into the air, or this is the policy that would plant more trees in our community, something that would make it cooler. So you get to design the thing and then test it again and see if you have less of a chance of getting asthma. So after doing all this work, we realized that to send our kits to Philadelphia or DC or New York was not going to be the best bet. So everybody asked me to talk in particular about DC since they couldn't be on the call, but we did a kit workshop in Philadelphia and in New York and also in DC. And we worked with a hub staff in each city to design the workshop to meet the needs of their network. So each one was a little bit different. In National Geographic, we had a really different structure from the other three cities in that it was newer to the project. DC had one staff person coordinating the work. We saw in the video, Jared, and he had a huge network that had stopped and started a couple times along the way due to changes in their host institution. Jared wanted to quickly re-engage this network with some project work. First thing we did was we brought kits to the network and conducted that kind of a kit roundup where they tested everything and came up with a list of qualities. And that inspired the group to plan how to bring kits to public festivals. They were making calendars and getting all ready to take things out. But in order to build out the local examples, Jared needed some human resources on the building side. And so if you think about it, Franklin had an exhibit shop and education staff to support the development of the Rainy Row House. Pittsburgh and New York had several staff members building out kits that began at kit workshops, and also some partners like our Plinko partner who took that on as well. But Jared just had Jared, and he was also coordinating all the other aspects of CUSP. And he wasn't in the Asian division of that institution. So he turned to his partners and found a regional sustainability network that was willing to take the lead on building out some local kits and then sharing those with the broader network. So the Pittsburgh CUSP team worked with Jared and the sustainability network leaders to design an experience for their members and then arrived to facilitate the workshop. And the kit workshop happened at night in a hallway space of the city kind of maintenance building. The materials were all over the place, the space was really cluttered, and the kit roundup was spread out on every available surface. As people came in, we were kind of navigating our way through the myriad things we had brought. The network participants arrived, they tried the kits, they generated their list with qualities and had a really rich discussion about it. Some of the people felt that the only way to change people's behavior is to scare them, that the issue is just too urgent to make it this much fun. Others were intrigued with the mechanisms in some of the kits. The styrofoam balls are weighted foods that represented carbon, and they wondered if each activity could have weights that add up across the festival experience. So if you look in the top right-hand picture, there's a kid this is the way the multimodal kit developed. And in the back, each of the cars or buses or bikes on those streets are represented by a carbon bubble in the back. And like Richard's thing, we're trying to get the level below a certain line. And then some of the materials, we just use these, like he said, low-cost, everyday materials that are all over the place that people can pull out to help build out a kit. So the group was already thinking about these kind of nuances, but daunted by the process of building out ideas this late in the evening. It was like a Wednesday night. So staff from the City Sustainability Office offered to open up a workspace and keep materials available to the network participants. So 4 months later, I came back to observe the Fall Fest where the group was presenting their climate playground and found they had developed 2 custom kits from Pittsburgh by changing the images to reflect their community. One of them was an urban heat island one, but this one on the right is the Pittsburgh kit. It looks like a little city. You pour the water on it and the storm sewers overflow into the river. On the left, they had broken the city up into the 3 quadrants that their city was actually a planned city from way back when. So they have a commercial district, they have a dense residential, and then individual home residential. So they made it look like their world. So it's kind of a surface change, but it was something that people recognized when they came up. They had also built out a simpler version of the Carbon Cafe. So Carbon Cafe is on the top left, and those are plastic foods, but they have weights in them. So when you pick your meal and you put it on the scale, you get a sense for your carbon footprint. The weights represent how much carbon it takes to make each thing, and the little poster in the background gives you some ideas of where that energy is being spent. So they were really intrigued by that. But we had, on the bottom right, I don't know if you can see, there's little white boxes. And so they took those little white boxes and put pictures of the food on there and weighted them and did a very similar activity, but just with simpler materials. So they made their own hidden cost cafe. But then this woman showed up and she was sick, but she had been working on her kit and she brought the bag and left it with us. And it's called Want to Help the Earth? ? And what you do is you pick up boxes, and on the lids of the boxes, which are weighted, it has different choices. And one of the one that was kind of the most delightful to people was you could own and drive a hybrid car, or you could not eat meat 1 day a week. And if you put those on either ends of the balance, not eating meat once a week had a bigger carbon impact than owning and driving a hybrid. So for a lot of people in the community where buying a brand new fancy car was not even an option, this made us feel like, yeah, I could do that 1 day a week. That's a great thing. So that was kind of an exciting new evolution that she came up with. So well, in summary, we found custom experiences acted as boundary crossing experiences in convening people, coordinating a work process, and externalizing thinking. In terms of convening, the network activities brought partners in, and in particular, kits were an accessible entry point for many partners. Our work was coordinated by the iterative collective process of using, creating, and reflecting on kit designs, and all this work within a diverse group resulted in externalizing participants' ideas. So the iterative process also generated a common vocabulary for what we were doing together, but also allowed us to see what different partners brought to the table in a way that made our projects better. And then as we keep moving forward, we may not be developing new kits, we're hopefully helping other people think about it, but other people are developing kits. They're being used to elicit conversation in a multiple context. So not only festivals, but our museum galleries are using them, community meetings use them, schools use them, as Richard mentioned. And our partners are continuing to collaborate in new ways, holding workshops, running programming that's grounded in the custom approach. And so that's what Michaela will talk about after we have a moment for questions.
Are there any questions? So up to this point in the presentation? Yep.
The kits you've designed, I'm particularly interested in the weights kits and those things. Are those documented somewhere so that one could recreate that?
Yes, we've got descriptions of all the kits available on our website. And we don't have specifically like a kind of how to build it, but I think that the information on our website, it gives you a sense of how to use it, and there's kind of pictures. They're all pretty everyday materials. And we are also happy to follow up. We've talked with people, about even from other parts of the country about ways that the kits might be, that they might adapt and build them. So we're doing work here in Pittsburgh with our network to kind of help people with that own process of building their kits. But we're happy to chat by phone based on what people are inspired by from what they see online.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so now we shift over to New York, is that right?
Yep, that's correct. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you share your screen?
I'm going to turn on my video just for a minute, just to say hello from New York. I'm here at the New York Hall of Science. It's a little quiet, but you can kind of see the museum floor behind me, just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from. And like Marian and Richard and Rachel have alluded to, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how these kits have worked in action here in New York, as well as talk about some of the other products and processes that we use, a little bit about our digital map, and a little bit about our mini grant process. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And great. Can everyone see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So I don't have too many slides, but I do have a few stories. So the first story that I wanted to tell you is actually about one of our partners, the White Roof Project. Is anyone familiar with either the White Roof Project in New York or groups that do sort of white coatings on roofs in Philly?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, cool. So I'm not going to give you too much of a background on what they do, but what's interesting is they joined our network sort of unsure about what they would get out of the CUSP network. So this is a group, they don't consider themselves educators, even though we know that Richard considers everyone educators. So they don't consider themselves educators, and they're really just focused on sort of this infrastructure project. They're really experts on how to code a roof. But in order to do that successfully, they need to meet with co-op boards, they need to meet with building managers, and they need to sort of convince these people why they should allow this group up on the roof for this coding. And along with that, there are a number of insurance issues and other sort of logistical concerns. And so they have been really struggling with how to ramp up their efforts, particularly in neighborhoods on the Lower East Side of New York. And they really were struggling. And the way that they had traditionally sort of presented information to folks was through a PowerPoint, much like I'm doing now. But I think that we've all seen that those hands-on kits are actually a little bit more fun. But what was more important was not only were the kits more fun, and again, this is a picture that involves a child here, but in general, the White Roof Project is working with groups of adults at co-op board meetings. So not only was it fun, but the kit, the way that it was designed, allowed for a shared foundation for a conversation. So now the White Roof Project had moved from just sort of experts giving information and telling folks why we need to coat your roof, to initiating a conversation where they were able to sort of see what's going to convince these people. For some folks, it might be the bill, the energy savings. For other folks, it might be the environmental focus. For other folks, it might be just sort of comfort and air quality. And so through this kit that they had developed, they were really able to start having these conversations. And what was interesting was to see how the White Roof Project sort of, I don't want to say grew over time, but how their participation in the CUSP network shifted, where they initially came in unsure of really what their connection to this network might be. They saw the kits that we saw today and that we've been mentioning. So they saw sort of kits that had already been developed and refined by other network members. And then they were able to take that approach to apply it to their own kit that allowed them to really, again, have the types of conversations they wanted to have rather than just sort of be experts giving information. And of course, I think we could all tell stories about all of our network members, but I thought that one might be of interest because it is a little bit different from some of the sort of festival settings that we've been talking about. The other thing that I wanted to show you is the CUSP map, and I'm actually going to stop sharing for a moment just so I can switch. I'm going to pull up the CUSP map. Has anyone seen the CUSP digital map before or played around with it at all?
Yeah.
Yep.
Some have, some haven't.
Some have, some haven't. Okay. So let me go ahead and share this. So the CUSP map is a digital map that's available now. Can everyone see it up here?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. It's just cuspmap.org. There's a New York City version of the map, and there's a Pittsburgh version of the map. I'm going to talk mostly about New York City. So what we were seeing was that there were a lot of really great data sets available, particularly in New York City. So there's New York City open data. There's a lot of information out there. But that information is not local, it's not relevant, and it's not always solutions focused. So even though these data sets and these data visualizations existed, it was hard for lay people to make sense of it. And even when they could sort of understand what the visualization was showing them or what the data was telling them, it didn't relate to their own life. So in much the same way that Pittsburgh took a lead on the kids, New York spent some time trying to develop this digital map in a way that really embodied that CUSP approach of local, relevant, and solutions-focused. So I'm going to just show you a few of the features, but hopefully you'll be so inspired that you want to go home and play around with this later. But the map marries hard data sets. So we have, projected floodplains. We have sort of weather and climate projections. We can look here and sort of see these projections. But it marries these data sets with the ability for users to add their own points. So I'm going to turn this off. And so users, whether it's our partners or just sort of average New Yorkers that we've never met, are able to start to document impacts that they've seen. So a lot of people will snap photos of flooding and post it to the map. Or, for example, here, can everyone see that? This person was actually really excited because Con Edison, our local utility, was doing energy audits. And this person had no idea that this was a thing that could happen, but she was saying that she'd been spending a lot of money on AC over the summer and was excited to see how this might help her save some money, and that she wanted to share it with everyone. So sometimes, again, it's solutions that are being shared, sometimes it's impacts that are being shared. The other thing that we saw was really powerful was helping people understand why you would want to use a tool like this at all. So folks in New York, Sandy is still very much in our minds, and so people are very interested in seeing, okay, this is the flooding from Hurricane Sandy. How does that compare to where we think flooding might occur moving forward? So you're able to layer this information, and then also, how does this affect our subway routes? So now we can start to take a closer look at how all of these data sets work together to tell climate stories in our neighborhood. And for those of us that rely on public transportation, this is a really important story to us. It also helps explain why the subways are not always working on the weekends, because the city's doing sort of resiliency infrastructure work. So this mix of the ability to layer data in a way to tell stories, and it's explained in a very sort of simple way, that mixed with the ability to have our own conversations and share back. So again, it's about having a conversation, this time online, but still, everyone is an expert in their own story. Everyone's sort of impacted by climate change in their own way, and everyone's contributing to solutions in their own way. This map allows for that conversation rather than just the output of information. And then the last thing that I wanted to show you quickly, so many cusps, is up at the top of the map, in order to help sort of orient people to how this map could be used, we have several what we call stories. So these are a series of linked points that will start to turn on and off layers, that will start to highlight different user-added points to give folks a sense of how this tool might be used. And most of this data, like I said, is coming from other sources. So CUSP was not the group that put together this information, but we've curated the information that already existed and that the city wants out there, and put it in this platform that allows it to be a little more user-friendly, and allows folks to feel like they have ownership over that. So you can see here, I'm just doing a quick overview of this. But again, this is the wastewater story. So it starts by documenting what are some of the things we expect to see and ends up with what are some of the solutions that you can be involved in. So that's the CUSP map. Before I move on to mini grants, are there any questions about the map? I know that was really fast.
I have a question about the curation process.
Yeah.
To what extent do you seek to validate the data that you incorporate in a platform that you have your name on?
So the information that we're getting is from the city or from our partners at Columbia. So it's information that we feel is valid. For the user added points, those are things that we as admins check regularly, and rather than deleting something that might have misinformation, there's an option to sort of have a conversation. And so if someone has a misconception, we're able to reply to that rather than sort of just taking it off, because chances are someone has the same misconception.
Thank you.
Actually, I had a question on that as well. So the crowdsourced data, does it go directly onto the map, or does it go to some place first and it's critiqued and looked at?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we really debated that as a network. So not just me or the New York Hall of Science, but our whole network really talked about what do we want that process to look like. Because we were concerned about, people being inflammatory, people posting inappropriate things. The initial decision was, let's just have it go up immediately. Because what we were seeing in prototyping was that people wanted to check their point right away. They were excited about adding something, and they wanted to see it. And we didn't want to have a login because it just increases the barrier to posting. And we sort of decided, let's just see how that goes. And we're several years in at this point, and that's still the way it's been because we've never had anyone post any climate denial statements, anything inappropriate. That's not a challenge to all of you to start trolling this map, but we've been really lucky that people are using it as a tool. And like I said, sometimes there's misconceptions, sometimes there's misinformation, but there's never been anything inappropriate. And so right now, it's as soon as you post, it goes up on the map.
Thank you.
Any other map questions? Great. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about one other aspect of the CUSP project, but I do hope that you take some time to look at the map in more detail, because I did just give a very quick overview. So I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. There. So we've talked about the kits, and we've talked about the CUSP map, and now I want to talk about our mini grant process. And my fellow CUSPers can talk a little bit more maybe about the origins of mini grants if there are questions, but I kind of want to talk about where they are now. And so in each of our cities, we have a process for providing small grants to our partners, and this money and these very small grants really allow our partners the space and time to think about how does the CUSP approach work for them. So like Marian showed, our networks are very diverse. We have partners with all sorts of missions. Some of them are very explicitly climate focused and others are not. And so these mini grants have been a really powerful way to encourage our network to collaborate and to really internalize the CUSP approach into their own work. So the story that I want to tell here is about the Bathgate Community Garden in the Bronx in New York City. And this was a mini grant project between the garden itself, so just a group of community members, the New York Restoration Project, and a nonprofit called Week Rocket. And the community garden had been noticing that they were having real issues with flooding, that there was pools of water in the garden that would then spill off into the street, and they didn't really know what to do about it. Climate change wasn't really on their radar. They were interested in the environment, but they were actually more interested in food justice and having access to high quality produce. So Weed Rocket and New York Restoration Project came in, and they were existing CUSP partners, and they were able to use the kit and they were able to use the map to start helping the community think about, well, what role is climate change playing in this flooding that's really affecting your garden? So here you can see them using the New York version of the kit that you just played around with. We call it extreme events. And so the community members were able to learn a little bit about what the issue was, and then they actually had a landscape architect come in and talk about, well, what are some potential solutions that we could apply to this situation? And the community decided on a rain garden. And so the community actually helped design the rain garden. They decided sort of what flowers and plants would work best there. They took part in all of the build days, and so there was a lot of digging out of things, a lot of leveling things, moving soil, and at the end of the day, the community ended up with this beautiful rain garden that really allowed them to better enjoy the garden, the community garden as a whole, and they were starting to talk to their other community members about climate change, and hey, climate change is a thing that's affecting our neighborhood, and that we were able to be part of the solution. Going back to the mini grants, however, this small amount of money, so each institution received $2,000, even though that money doesn't seem like a lot, it was more the support and the process of going through applying for this grant that was really powerful for this group in particular. So they really weren't sure how to work together. The Community Garden, Weed Rocket, and New York Restoration Project had similar goals in mind, but weren't sure of the process for working together. They really hadn't had a lot of time to think about, well, how are we going to apply what we've learned from CUSP? And so this process allowed them to really sit down and think about, what does CUSP mean for us, and how do we see local relevant and solutions focus in our work? And in addition to the monetary support, CUSP staff was around to help answer questions, provide climate science expertise. We were there on the build days. So again, it was just a really nice way to have these folks learn about CUSP, not just through a PowerPoint presentation, but through actually seeing in action in their own community. And then one other story that's been really interesting is from the Gowanus Canal Conservancy in the Gowanus neighborhood of New York City. And they have actually created a curriculum that's been shared with the CUSP network. So one of the asks that we have in New York City is that whatever is created through a CUSP mini grant is documented in a way that can be shared, whether it's a physical sort of like, here's a curriculum, or here's a kit, or here's the lessons I've learned with the rest of the network. And so in this particular case, Gowanus Canal Conservancy was able to add a climate change unit to an existing curriculum that they already had, and prototyped it with a local school, and it was documented by another partner that does filmmaking. And through this documentation, they were able to spread this curriculum to other neighborhoods in New York City. So I'm going to ask either Richard or Rachel to maybe show the video now, because the video does a much better job than I can.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Michaela. That's not what I wanted. All right. Let's load in. There we go.
This is our Thomas Green Park redesign. Thomas Green Park is a park that's by a place called the Gowanus Canal, and that is filled with sewage, chemicals, all kinds of stuff like that. And when it floods this entire area and almost destroys the park. But we redesigned it in a way where we hope that will never happen again.
The students just completed a mission called Gowanus Redesign, and the task was to redesign 2 spaces in the Gowanus Canal, one being on the waterfront at the DeGraw Street end, and the other being Thomas Green Park, to make them more resilient to climate change impacts.
What we did in this mission was basically set out a big problem. Here's the big problem going on. We want to make the Gowanus neighborhood more resilient, and how can we do that? And the learning happens by a little bit of like trial and error or tinkering or creating something that will help the Gowanus neighborhood become more resilient.
We have students who live right near the Gowanus Canal, whose homes may have been flooded in events like Hurricane Sandy. And in a project-based learning setting, we're giving students not only content and skills, but we're connecting them to an issue that we believe really matters. And students respond really well to that because our students want to be connected to things that really matter.
The components of that were to learn more about green infrastructure and to decide which kinds of green infrastructure the students would want to use.
You have 5 minutes to talk? That's all you get before we do a first round of feedback. We give each other feedback, and then you're going to get introduced to the budget.
Another big component of it was to create a budget. We actually gave them a budget, so they had to create a plan that was within a certain amount of money.
Over the course of this project, we had landscape architects giving the students feedback on their designs. We had community members that were on the board of the park that the students redesigned. We had members from the Gowanus Canal Conservancy sort of advising us and our students as we went along.
Yeah, they could take away his land, his property, and change that. But he's the government. It's called, I forgot what it's supposed to. Excellent powers, eminent domain.
And then we showcased the project at a couple of different events. The Gowanus Canal Conservancy's yearly expo, a New York City Department of Education Sustainability Showcase, and a Gowanus Canal Community Action Group meeting.
They were presenting to our elected officials, Nydia Velasquez, Joanne Simon. Students were so proud and excited to share their ideas with these people, and they were so excited to hear them.
This is the goat food that we took out because it's already contaminated, and we decided to put the 8 million gallons of food tank in here, and we replaced it with lawn after. Oh, this is beautiful. I love it. What I learned is that we can actually do something to make the canal a better place and a better community for people.
Yes, I was very shocked to learn about how dirty New York City is. The environment isn't really that safe for animals, not even for humans.
And whenever you go to the canal, always think about the history that has been there and there's, even if you're a person, you could always make a change. So always have hope in yourself.
The kids respond so well. I mean, they were ecstatic. They were just so excited to be building and trying stuff out.
Even though we really spend a lot of time looking at the data in the past, in the present, and the future, I don't believe our students are fearful. I think they're hopeful and they're excited to be a part of educating their community and designing solutions so that we can all be safe and healthy and happy.
So we're going to have a chance to ask Michaela some questions. And I'm just going to do a quick summary, but I love this video, and I think it's a great example of what we do. All right, so, sorry. Just quick sort of conclusion. I know that was a lot of information. So, in thinking about the CUSP approach and where CUSP is today, a couple of themes sort of actually surprisingly sort of emerged just getting prepared for today's presentation, and how we would sort of say you could adopt all of this, all these lessons learned, all this experience to your own work if you're not already, because again we have a lot of partners who are participating today, but there's a couple of different different places, and there's multiple points of entry, so by no way do you have to follow this as sort of like a roadmap that's beginning to end, but what we would emphasize is first, identify a research-based approach to climate change education or climate change communication. So not resting on our laurels, scary gloom and doom, but adopting something that is in line with the research. And for us, that's always been local, relevant, solutions focused. Then it's adapting existing resources. Working with museum partners or existing educational materials that are online or wherever they're coming from in your communities, and adapting those to your programming, your initiatives. And as Marianne said, what we discovered is actually those are the boundary objects that we're all using to sort of wrap our heads around getting on the same page around climate change communication in our own communities. Seeking a community of practice where you can iterate on your ideas, you can identify gaps, you can identify opportunities, you can identify emerging promising practices. And then collaborating, innovating, producing new materials or collaborative initiatives where you're creating something that hasn't been done yet. And that's sort of where, at the level of the mini grants and the kit workshops, where you're actually kind of co-producing things that are new and tailored really specifically to your own work. But by no means is climate change communication solved. Obviously, it's a moving target. There are a lot of nuances that we do acknowledge. So we don't want this to, by any means, discourage innovation on any of this. But it's just sort of getting you started in thinking about approaching this in your own work. So just highlight a couple of resources. The first two, Connecting on Climate and Eco America, absolutely fabulous deep dives into the climate change communication research and why local relevant solutions focused works. CUSPproject.org is the CUSP website where you can find a lot of resources, access to partners, access to activities. The Clean Net work is a clearinghouse of climate change education activities as well. Again, just trying to get you some starting points and where you can identify existing resources if you don't want to just go ahead and create something from scratch. And then CUSP is part of a larger initiative called the Climate Change Education Partnership Alliance. And this is a nationwide group of projects, 6 across the country, who are all actually doing different approaches to the same problem of how do we do climate change communication more often and more effectively. And so if you're even some who are in the Northeast, so if you're looking for local partners, you can look on that website to see if there's other local partners just besides CUSP that you can work with. And climatecentral.org, again, Columbia, the Center for Climate Systems Research, has been amazing in giving us our downscaled climate projections. And we're happy to facilitate contact with them, but climatecentral.org is also really great at doing downscaled climate projections as well, so you can check them out. And if you want to get in contact with us, cusp.fi.edu will get you in contact with any one of the speakers today. So I'm going to take some questions, but thank you very much.
Just wondering if you have any questions online.
Well, there's one question online. I think it's for the Casper map data. So the question is it possible that city might want to appear to be climate change compliant when the in-the-ground reality is quite different? So is there any, has anyone done a sampling to verify the data?
I think Michaela addressed that a little bit before, but Michaela, are you able to turn your mic on?
Yeah, I heard some of the question, but can you paraphrase it?
I think, is it possible cities would like to project themselves as being climate change compliant when in reality they're not so much? And how do you verify the data?
I think that's definitely possible. One of the reasons that I trust the data that we're using for the CUS map is that in isolation, it kind of doesn't tell that story. So it's not something where you would look at the data and be like, oh, the city's trying to sort of project one thing, because each of the data sets is sort of its own in isolation and coming from different agencies. We also have relationships with these city agencies, so the agencies are members of our network. And so again, it's coming from sources that we have some relationship with. We have enough expertise within the network to sort of be able to vet the data, even if we're not combing through it, you know, at a very fine print. And then we also, anything related to climate change is coming directly from our climate science partners. Does that answer the question?
It's an online question, so we don't know. Nobody's flipping a table over here, so I think they're okay with that answer.
Are there any other online questions? That's it? Do you have any other questions in the room?
I guess, so the CUSP project as funded ends when, and sort of what is the planned follow-on that might continue in each of the places, you know, sort of locally funded or funded through other means?
Yeah, so the project is in year 6 of 5. So we basically have, you know, the ability to keep going until all the money is spent, and we project that to be somewhere. Each city may spend out earlier than the other, but the central office here in Philly will go through August at least, and maybe a few months after. And I think the big question now is how do we sustain this amazing work? And I know that there are at least components that we're all invested in figuring out how to sustain, which definitely the local partner networks. You know, partnerships take a lot of work and a lot of time, and they're functioning, they're very vibrant communities right now, and no one is interested in losing that momentum. So trying to keep that going, and then applying for smaller grants to continue sort of the things that have shown the most success. So, you know, it's a big question. Yeah.
Was privatization of any of this, or commercialization of any of it considered as you went through the network?
Of the
Of the kits, of the tools that you developed? Were
Well,
there any things where you saw that opportunity?
I'll speak for myself, but being federally funded, you're mostly open source. So these are meant to be, you know, moving the field forward. So, you know, this is basically, we provide this for free and sort of the capacity building for free. When the grant ends, you know, there are some products that each city has created. The row homes, for example, we will loan for people for free, you know, in perpetuity. But if people wanted to purchase like other row homes, we have the ability to do that. And in fact, there was a museum down in Richmond, Virginia that purchased 10 of these for their own work. So there's but that wasn't really on our radar, for sure.
I have a question about the content or sort of the regularity of the meetings that you've had, like over the past 6 years. I mean, from the images, it seemed like lots of exciting events, but it seemed like a lot of them were public events, and so maybe you get, you know, one cohort of people one day, and then another cohort, another people, and then. But I sort of heard in the background that there were members, there were partners that are. So, how much of the sort of success that you've had do you think is because there's been a core group that's sort of followed this through, or is it, you know, kind of a snowball effect that are you gradually building a community of people who regularly attend events?
Does anyone in Pittsburgh or New York want to?
I think that New York is sort of on one end of the spectrum, and I think Philly and Pittsburgh meet a little more frequently. One of the interesting things that we started with was this idea that all of the cities would be really similar, and that we would switch products, and that they would sort of move around. And as the project moved on, we really recognized the differences in cities. Are there any native New Yorkers or folks that have lived in New York before in the room?
Yeah.
Yes.
So, like, you know that it can take an hour and a half to get from Queens to Brooklyn, even though it's like 3 miles. And so we were recognizing that it's really hard to get folks in the same room for a meeting on a consistent basis. And that's one of the reasons that we really focused on a digital platform. And so we did have meetings, and I think towards the last few years, we'd say, like, we'd have 2 big sort of all-network meetings every year, and then we had mini meetings. And sometimes those were around a particular topic, sometimes they were focused in a particular neighborhood, so like we had a lot of partners in Gowanus. And so even though it was important to have sort of like a core group running through, the ways that we interacted with that core group didn't always have to be face-to-face. And I think that worked really well for New York.
Yeah, and I would say in Pittsburgh, sorry you can't see us. We're struggling. I don't know why our video is not working. But, you know, I think that flexibility that Michaela talked about was really important in Pittsburgh as well. You know, one of the most important things about our network is that, you know, we call it a heterogeneous network. There's so many different kinds of organizations and individual expertise that's involved. The strength has been that different people and different organizations have found different elements of the project interesting to them. But keeping our core message of, you know, doing climate change communication by being local, relevant, and systems focused, that's allowed our project to go in a lot of different directions, but stay really grounded. We did, you know, knowing that, you know, the end is in sight for the end of our grant, we've been just actively talking with our network about what elements of this work and of the meeting in particular are most important to carry forward. What we've heard from our network is that people like getting together to create, I mean, in our case, they really like creating kids or educational experiences. We've got folks in our network who are interested in exploring different topics. I think climate change is important, but we've also got other concerns that are related to the environment and are very community focused, like lead paint in soil, or our water, maybe our water quality that's related to lead, and that's not directly climate change specific. So we're continuing with climate change, but are also exploring some of these other interests that are emerging.
And I don't know, correct me if you're wrong, but you might be been asking a little bit about like the impact on like the sustained impact, like on the communities, like whether or not they're just getting disparate sort of interactions with us, or if it's a more sustained sort of building on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just curious if it was sort of, if there was you know, if your impact, if your sort of sphere of impact was gradually increasing with time, or whether you were instead, there was a core group of people that was, you know, hitting this group one day and the next month hitting that group and that group. So you're sort of spreading around your impact, but you're not getting repeat customers, so to speak.
Right, and that I should like have a flow chart at this point for like how the networks and everything work together. But I mean, I think as Michaela said, it's different in each city, and I think in Pittsburgh and New York's case, it's more of that core group, and in Philadelphia, we've actually keep on expanding and expanding. So our network is really it's very very much growing still, and so we have people who have been with us from year one, but we also are like taking on new partners all the time. So it's just sort of branching out further and further.
I would say too, this is Marianne, that when we started the project, we were looking at measures of public audience, but it became really clear pretty quickly that the network was a powerful tool, and that having people in the network shift from I care about climate change, but I'm afraid to talk about it, to, well, we can't do this without talking about climate change. You know, like people are shifting their comfort level and their sense of community around being someone who can talk about it, and each of those people has an audience, right? So rather than trying to be like the museum that broaches this topic, all of a sudden we have 40 partners who are broaching the topic in all their various settings with all their various audiences. So we're pretty excited about the power of that.
Thank you. Cool. Okay.
Awesome.
All right, well, thanks. Let's a round of applause for all our customers. You guys should mention have been sponsors of this series since the beginning. So
yeah, so that's nice.
Yes, we appreciate that. Partnership. Please join us next month for focus on water systems. And thanks. Thanks everybody for joining virtually.
Thank you.